Allen Ginsberg is perhaps the most important of the poets of the Beat generation. And I have to admit that in my own life, Allen Ginsberg has been one of those core poets that I discovered pretty early on in my poetic career and in my love of poetry, and has been kind of always in the back of my mind whenever I write. Ginsberg is perhaps a poet who has one of the more outsider positions in American literary history, especially in the mid-century. If we think about poets and writers like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Jack Kerouac, we think of these men who had these formative experiences in and after World War II, men who went and fought or at least contributed to the war effort against Germany and Japan, and then came back to an America that was becoming increasingly skeptical and ultimately, arguably, paranoid about the threat of communism and the threat of non-Western influence in America. Allen Ginsberg, however, was raised by a mother who was a member of the Communist Party. Now, how did this come to be? Well, Allen Ginsberg grew up on the East Coast, like our friends Kerouac and Ferlinghetti, and yet he was part of a Jewish community on the East Coast that, well, they weren't Christian. They had less in common with the Catholic and Protestant upbringings of much of the Beat generation. And when the Beat generation, rejected conventional American Protestant lifestyles, morality, things like that, it was usually because they were reacting against their upbringing. I think this is especially true when it comes to people like Neil Cassidy and others. But Allen Ginsberg grew up in a household that was already kind of skeptical of American capitalism, American Protestantism. And so he had always kind of what seemed among his friend group by the time he was among the Beats, a bit of an outsider perspective. Allen Ginsberg also grew up in a difficult home. His father was a writer, a poet. His mother, as I mentioned, was a member of the Communist Party. His mother also severely struggled with mental illness. And some of Ginsberg's memories of his childhood that he writes about when he's an adult are trying to figure out what is going on with my mother. She would take him to communist meetings. She would also take him to mental health checkups, and he grew up with a difficult relationship with his mother, but also saw his mother's anger at the American stance toward communism. In fact, when Jack Kerouac met Allen Ginsberg and ended up writing about him, he gave him the pseudonym Carlo Marx. It's a bit on the nose, but that's how it goes. So Ginsberg met Kerouac and Cassidy and other people who were important to the Beat generation, like Lucien Carr and others at Columbia University. They all kind of ended up there. As we've said before, Kerouac didn't finish his course of study at Columbia, whereas people like Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg did. So I want to talk a little bit about the poem Howl, which is kind of the central poem of Ginsberg's career. This is Howl. We've talked about it on the channel before. It's a poem that's long. It owes a lot to the free verse tradition that Walt Whitman started. In fact, on the front page of Howl, which is published by City Lights Books, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, we'll talk more about the interesting story of Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg in a moment. But on the first page of this version, we have Howl and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg, published by City Lights Books, San Francisco, 1956. And we have a quotation on this front page from Walt Whitman himself: "Unscrew the locks from the doors, unscrews the doors themselves from their jambs." this idea of opening up the world, of opening up that which has been closed, is central to both Whitman's concept of the democratization and the freedom that America provides and can provide both the common man and the poet in particular. And it really is part of Ginsberg's vision as well. And yet Ginsberg, if you read Howl, you'll quickly see Ginsberg's vision of America is much darker, much more troubled. This isn't the hopeful optimism that you find in, say, Whitman's Song of Myself. This is, well, as the opening line of the first section says, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. This is a generation that's gone mad. Now, Howl is a poem of many lines. It's written in 3 sections. All told, it's about 25 pages long, including the introduction. And you can see the lines are very long. And this is, once again, in imitation of Whitman. And it's not just to be like Whitman, it's to allow for the expansive, hypnotic, we might even say psychedelic tone and rhythm of the poem. The poem is not written in regular meter, it's not written in rhyme, but you can tell there's attention to the sections. So the first section, part 1, starts with that line I read you, and there's this repeated opening word of the lines, who. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night. Who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness. Who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated. Who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war. Who were expelled from the academies for crazy, etc. I didn't even read all of how long those lines were. I just gave you a little sampling of the first page. So we have these who, not at the beginning of every line, but you end up with some lines that are very, very long. If you look at the bottom of the second page here, we have who chained themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine under the noise of wheels, and children brought them down shuddering, mouth racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo. It's hard not to read it fast. It's hard not to get caught up in the rhythm of it. And if you listen to recordings, you can go online or you can buy these on Apple Music, recordings of Ginsberg reading this. He has kind of a high voice, a voice that kind of sounds a little, we might think, nerdy. And if you hear him read, it starts out and you're like, oh, is this going to be very entertaining? But it becomes incantatory. The second section of Howl changes this opening repeated phrase. It goes from who to Moloch. It starts, what sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains in imagination. Very violent and traumatic sounding, but we have all this mad generation who did all these things, and then we have who did this to them? And the answer is Moloch. Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. Moloch becomes this dark figure. Moloch is a pagan god in the Old Testament, and Moloch seems to stand in for those forces in America which are driving men mad. Finally, in the third section, we have this address to Carl Solomon. Now, Carl Solomon was a friend of Ginsberg who suffered from a lot of the things that are described in this poem. And we have this incantatory repeated phrase now, I'm with you in Rockland. Carl Solomon, I'm with you in Rockland, where you're madder than I am. I'm with you in Rockland, where you must feel strange. I'm with you in Rockland, where you imitate the shade of my mother. I'm with you in Rockland. I'm with you in Rockland. And then we have this final line, I'm with you in Rockland. In my dreams you walk dripping from a sea journey across the highway, across America in tears to the door of my cottage in the western night. It's very beautiful, this idea of I'm going to be with you in your struggle. I'm going to be with you in your madness. I'm going to be with you in your torment. There's a lot more to say about this poem in interpretation, but I hope this gives you a sense of the scope of the poem. So when Ginsberg first debuted Howl, he read it at Sixth Gallery in San Francisco, and Ferlinghetti immediately sent him basically a invitation to submit it to City Lights Books, and it was published as number 4 in their pocket poetry series. Now, if that was the whole story, it would just be like, okay, cool, publisher likes poem, publishes it, everyone loves it. Well, it turned out not everyone did love it, and the San Francisco police impounded the paperback edition of Howl and arrested and charged Lawrence Ferlinghetti with obscenity. Now, because Ferlinghetti was the publisher, he was the one who was criminally liable, not Ginsberg, right? Ginsberg was just the writer. He can write whatever he wants. It's Ferlinghetti who's selling it to the public. And so this charge of obscenity was a tricky one. It's something that came up throughout American history, throughout the history of the 20th century. Books like D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, books like James Joyce's Ulysses had from time to time been either banned isn't quite the right word. It's not allowed for sale in the United States because of the content. And so this obscenity charge basically meant that Howl couldn't be sold. Of course, this also incredibly inflated the popularity of Howl and the fame of people like Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg, and also just the beat movement in general. There was a trial, and Ferlinghetti had to testify. There were academics who came up and, discussed, is this obscene? Is this art? Eventually, Ferlinghetti won the trial, and it was put back in print. And now, as you can see me holding it here, it's still widely published. It's gone through, I don't know how many printings. But the obscenity thing is interesting because Ginsberg, it's not like no one had written about drugs, about madness, about, political dissent. It's not like no one had written about this before, but there was something about both the power of the poetry and also explicit language that wasn't present even in the writings of other poets of the 50s. We've talked about Robert Lowell, we've talked about T.S. Eliot in the past. They were writing about people being disaffected, about illicit love affairs, things like that. But there was a rawness to Ginsberg's language. This is dramatized in a movie about Howl that was made, which stars James Franco as Allen Ginsberg. And in the movie, there's a scene where Franco as Ginsberg is talking about, I just wanted to see if I could say the F word in a poem and get away with it. So there may have been in Ginsberg a bit of a kind of just youthful rebellion. I want to say the bad word and get away with it. And yeah, it's not just he said a naughty 4-letter word. He's telling America to go F itself. And this is a bold, and, this is the 1950s. If we think about, American sentiment, American patriotism, given the reputation that Ginsberg already has for being associated with communism, associated with counterculture, Ginsberg was well known by this time to have, both had male and female lovers. This was seen as an affront to decency, affront to patriotism. And I think it's something we have to ask ourselves when it comes to the beats. William Burroughs, I think, fits into this category as well. Who was a novelist? He's not a poet, so we're not doing a separate video on him. But William Burroughs too was heavily critiquing not just things in American culture they didn't like, but America in general. So I think Howl is an interesting poem. And the phenomenon of the collection Howl is interesting because it presses on these questions about what is the role of poetry in society. Can a poem be so shocking, so crass, that it actually stops being licit? It actually stops, it somehow cancels itself from consideration by the thoughtful individual. I think the answer is yes. I don't think Howl, though, counts. I think Howl is a brilliant poem by a man who is deeply troubled and put that trouble into words very much, I would argue, in the same way that T.S. Eliot puts his trouble, the trouble within himself, and the troubledness because of the cultural moment he's in, into The Wasteland. The Wasteland also describes and uses language that was shocking to people, and yet became a cry for order, a cry for healing. And when I think about Howl and I think about the three sections, we often focus in our commentary on the first section of, the mind's driven mad. But the Moloch section and the I'm with you in Rockland section, I think show us it's not just about like celebrating or fetishizing, the crazy madness of the mid-century man. There's a desire for healing by the end, and this kind of tender I'm with you in Rockland, I'm traveling across the American night to be with you. Ultimately, this is a poem about a desire for sanity and reconciliation, even as it moves us through despair and madness and real anger and critique of the society that Ginsberg found himself in. Whatever you make of Ginsberg, he became the poetic voice of the Beat generation, and alongside someone like Kerouac, became this group of writers to be reckoned with, who create, even as non-traditional as they were, a new tradition, which people who come after them had to inherit. I want to share with you one more thing. The dedication to this book is interesting. Dedication to Jack Kerouac, the new Buddha of American prose, who spit forth intelligence into 11 books written in half the number of years, on the road, and he lists out all of Kerouac's books. He says several phrases in the title of Howl are taken from him. To William Seward Burroughs, author of Naked Lunch, an endless novel which will drive everybody mad. To Neil Cassidy, author of The First Third, an autobiography which enlightened Buddha. All these books are published in heaven. This language of Buddhism, this language of we're all enlightening each other, and also our books enlighten Buddha. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it also shows, as we talked about with Kerouac, this idea for spiritual enlightenment that ends up being sought outside of the Western Christian tradition, outside of Protestantism. For someone like Kerouac, that was more St. John of the Cross, more Catholic mysticism. For somebody like Ginsberg, it doesn't end up with Marx, it ends up with Buddhism. It ends up with this desire to be enlightened in a sort of pop beat Buddhist way. But there was always this spiritual striving in the beats, and I think it's something that we should take seriously as we consider them and the legacy that they've left us. Thanks.